the year 1206, a man named Temujin stood on the Mongolian steppe and declared himself ruler of every tribe from the Pacific coast to the Caspian Sea. He called himself Genghis Khan. What followed was not a conquest. It was a system. Every kingdom that fell became a base. Every army that surrendered became a weapon. Every road, every river, every trade route that the Mongols captured fed the next campaign. The empire did not grow because Genghis Khan was violent. It grew because it could not stop growing. An empire built on momentum dies the moment it stands still. By the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, the Mongols controlled more land than Rome had ever governed. And they were still moving. East had been consumed. China was falling. Central Asia was gone. Persia was gone. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, the seat of Islamic civilization for 500 years, would be ash by 1258. Every direction had been tested. Every direction had collapsed. There was one direction left, west. The steppe stretched from Mongolia all the way to Hungary, without a single mountain range to stop a cavalry army. To a Mongol general looking at a map, Europe was not a civilization. It was a corridor. And at the end of that corridor was what the Mongols called the Great Sea, the Atlantic Ocean, the edge of the world. Genghis Khan had given his generals one standing order: ride until you reach the water. They had not reached it yet. In 1237, Batu Khan and Subutai turned the full weight of the Mongol Empire toward that corridor. Kievan Rus fell in 3 years. Kiev, a city of 50,000 people, was reduced to a few hundred survivors. The Mongols did not destroy cities out of cruelty. They destroyed them as a message to the next city: surrender or become an example. By 1241, the Mongols had reached Poland and Hungary, the last kingdoms before the Atlantic. Europe had no idea what was coming. Not because they lacked intelligence, because nothing in their experience had prepared them for an army that moved at 60 miles a day, that had already destroyed every civilization between Mongolia and their border, and that did not negotiate. The Song dynasty had tried larger armies. Gone. The Persians had tried fortified cities. Gone. The Rus had tried coalition forces. Gone. Europe had nothing new to offer, and the Mongols knew it. Then something happened that no one predicted. In 1285, the largest Mongol army ever sent into Europe was destroyed, not by a great king riding at the head of a united European force, not by a crusade, not by divine intervention or a storm at sea, by a man who had already lost everything to them once. Now I know what you're thinking. Maybe Hungary got lucky. Maybe the Mongols were weaker by 1285. Here is what you need to understand. The Mongols used the exact same strategy in 1285 that had annihilated Hungary 40 years earlier. Every single step, the same split formation, the same winter timing, the same plan that had never failed them once in 60 years of conquest. They did not adapt. They did not adjust. And this time, it killed them. But here's the part that stays with me. Béla IV spent 30 years preparing for an invasion that the rest of Europe refused to believe was coming. He warned every king, every pope, every emperor who would listen. No one helped him. When the Mongols came in 1285, Hungary stood alone. The same Europe that had watched Hungary burn in 1241 and done nothing, watched again in 1285. Béla IV stopped it alone. He had been dead for 15 years by then. But what he built while he was alive held. One man, 44 years, and a question that no one else in Europe thought to ask. To understand what Béla IV was up against, you need to understand one number: 50%. Not the percentage of his army that died at Mohi, the percentage of his entire kingdom. Half of Hungary's population, killed or enslaved in 12 months. Not soldiers, people, farmers, merchants, priests, children. 40 to 50% of every village in the Hungarian plains burned to the ground. Agricultural production stopped completely for years. Regions that had fed cities for generations became dead zones that took a century to recover. The Mongols did not just defeat armies. They dismantled the systems that made civilizations function, and they did it the same way everywhere they went. That was not an accident. That was a method. The man behind the method was named Subutai. By 1241, Subutai was approximately 66 years old. He was so overweight he could no longer ride a horse. He sat in a cart behind the front lines and directed the largest coordinated military campaign the medieval world had ever seen. 5 separate armies moving simultaneously across 5 different routes into Central Europe. Each one precisely timed. Each one designed to prevent the Europeans from understanding what was happening until it was too late. He had been planning this for years. Not months, years. Before the first Mongol soldier crossed into Poland or Hungary, Subutai's agents had already been there. They learned the languages. They wore local clothing. They mapped the roads, counted the bridges, identified which lords controlled which territories, and reported back. By the time the Mongol army moved, Subutai knew the terrain of Central Europe better than most European kings knew their own kingdoms. That is the thing that almost no one in 1241 understood about the Mongols. They were not a force of nature. They were not an unstoppable wave. They were a system built on information, speed, and the absolute certainty that they understood their enemy better than their enemy understood them. The Song dynasty had tried to stop them with walls. Gone. The Abbasid Caliphate had tried to stop them with numbers. Gone. Kievan Rus had tried to stop them with coalition armies. Gone. Every civilization had brought its best answer, and every civilization had brought an answer the Mongols had already studied, already planned for, and already broken somewhere else. The reason was simple. By the time any kingdom faced the Mongols, Subutai already knew exactly what that kingdom was going to do. And then there was Hungary in 1241. Béla IV brought 60,000 men to the river Sajó. He had heavy cavalry, fortified positions, numerical parity. By every conventional measure, he had a real chance. Subutai looked at all of that and saw one thing: a king who had never lost to him before. A king who did not yet know what losing to him meant. That was the last advantage Subutai would ever have over Hungary. Here is the question that historians have argued about for 800 years. The Mongols destroyed the Song dynasty, Kievan Rus, the Abbasid Caliphate, and the Persian Empire. Every army that faced them, with better numbers, better terrain, more time to prepare, lost. Every single one. Why did Europe survive? The answer comes down to one kingdom, one king, and 44 years, the night of April 10th, 1241. The Hungarian army had camped on the west bank of the Sajó River. 60,000 men, the largest force Hungary had ever assembled. Béla IV had called in every favor, summoned every lord, pulled together every knight and foot soldier the kingdom could produce, and that night, they won. A Mongol force attacked the bridge across the Sajó just before midnight. The Hungarians were ready. They drove the Mongols back across the bridge with crossbow fire, held the crossing, and pushed the attackers into the darkness on the other side. By the time the fighting stopped, the camp was celebrating. The Mongols had tested them and been turned away. The river was held. The army was intact. The men slept. Now cut to the other side of that river. Subutai was not at the bridge. He had not been near the bridge all night. While Béla IV's army was celebrating their midnight victory, Subutai was several miles downstream, in the dark, looking at a section of the Sajó where there were no guards, no torches, no Hungarian soldiers at all. He had planned for Hungary to win that night. The attack on the bridge was not a failed assault. It was a distraction, loud enough to pull Hungarian attention north, long enough for Subutai to move half the Mongol army across the river at a completely different location, in complete silence, and position them behind the Hungarian camp before sunrise. Think about what that means. While Hungary celebrated holding the bridge, Subutai was already behind them. At dawn on April 11th, Batu Khan attacked the bridge again, this time with 7 siege engines firing simultaneously. Arrows in volumes the Hungarians had never experienced. Then smoke. Then fire from something no European army had encountered before, a weapon brought from China, burning material launched in clay pots that exploded on impact and could not be extinguished with water. The Hungarians scrambled to hold the bridge. They were still holding it when the first Hungarian soldier turned around and saw Subutai's cavalry on the wrong side of the river. The army had been encircled before the battle had officially begun. What followed was not a battle. It was a destruction. 60,000 men trying to break out of an encirclement they had not seen forming. The Mongols deliberately left one gap in the circle, a corridor to the west that looked like an escape route. Hungarian soldiers flooded into it. The Mongols rode alongside the corridor on both flanks, picking off men as they ran, for miles. By the end of April 11th, Hungary had lost approximately 60,000 men. In the ruins of what remained, one detail stayed in the accounts. 5 stone castles east of the Danube had survived the invasion. Everything around them burned. The castles stood. No one wrote about why at the time. It was a footnote in a catastrophe. On the same day that Béla IV's army was being destroyed at the Sajó, a different battle was happening 400 miles north. The city of Legnica, April 9th, 1241. Henry II, Duke of Silesia, had assembled a coalition force to hold the Mongol advance through Poland. He was waiting for reinforcements. King Wenceslas of Bohemia was one day's march away with 50,000 soldiers. One day. The messengers had confirmed it. But Henry's territory was burning. The villages around Legnica were being raided. His people were fleeing. His lords were standing in front of him asking what he intended to do while everything he was responsible for was destroyed around him. A duke does not wait behind walls while his people burn. That is not what the title means. That is not what the tradition demands. Every instinct, every obligation, every expectation of what a ruler was supposed to be told Henry II that he could not stand still. He marched out to meet the Mongols. The Mongols used the same tactic they had used at the Sajó 2 days later. Feigned retreat. The Polish cavalry pursued. The formation broke apart. The Mongols turned and encircled them. Henry II was killed in the fighting. The Mongols cut off his head and carried it on a spear around the walls of Legnica to show his army what had happened. Then, methodically, they moved through the battlefield and cut off the right ear of every body they found. 9 sacks of ears were collected from that field. Wenceslas arrived the next day with 50,000 soldiers. He received the news of the defeat. He turned around and marched home. One day. Henry II had needed one more day. Whether he knew Wenceslas was coming, whether he believed the reinforcements would arrive in time, whether he made a calculated decision or simply could not hold his position any longer, none of the sources tell us clearly. What the sources tell us is the result, and the result was 9 sacks of ears and a question that no one in Europe was able to answer. How do you defend against an enemy who turns your own discipline against you? Who wins by letting you do exactly what you are trained to do? Béla IV had no answer yet. He was running. Béla IV reached the Adriatic coast in the spring of 1242. He had been running for months. From the Sajó River west to Pest, from Pest south through the Hungarian plains, from the plains into Croatia, from Croatia to the coast. The Mongols had followed him the entire way, not because they needed him dead, because a kingdom without its king cannot be administered, cannot pay tribute, cannot be absorbed. Béla IV, alive and free, was the one thing that made Hungary ungovernable for them. He reached the fortress of Trogir on a small island just off the Dalmatian coast. Stone walls, sea on every side. The Mongols rowed to the shore, looked at the water, and turned back. He was safe. He had nothing else. The army was gone. The capital was ash. The plains that had fed Hungary for centuries were empty. The nobles who had survived were scattered, some of them already blaming him for the defeat, already asking the question that defeated kings always face. Why did you not see it coming? Why were we not ready? He had written to Frederick II before the invasion. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful ruler in Europe, the man whose armies could have changed what happened at the Sajó. Frederick refused. The reasons were not military. Frederick and Béla IV had history. 2 years before the Mongol invasion, Béla had sided with the Pope in a political dispute against Frederick. A disagreement about church authority and imperial power, the kind of conflict that consumed European politics in the 13th century and seemed at the time to matter enormously. When Béla wrote asking for help, Frederick remembered 50% of Hungary's population was killed or enslaved in the 12 months that followed. 1 million people. The plains abandoned, the cities burned, roads and bridges destroyed, entire regions that would not recover for 100 years. A portion of that, not all of it, but a portion, happened because 2 men could not set aside a political dispute. Frederick did eventually write to other European rulers, warning them about the Mongol threat. He sent letters to England and France calling for unity. Nothing came of it. Europe was too fractured, too consumed with its own conflicts, too unable to imagine that the thing happening in Hungary could reach them. Béla IV stood on the coast at Trogir and received none of it. What he did receive, according to the Hungarian chronicles written in the years after, was information. Reports from survivors, from lords who had made it out, from scouts sent back into the destroyed territory. And in those reports, among everything that had burned and collapsed and been erased, one detail appeared repeatedly. The stone castles had survived, not the wooden fortresses, not the earthen walls, not the palisades that Hungary had relied on for generations. Those were gone. But the stone castles, the ones built on high ground with thick walls and their own water supply, the Mongols had surrounded them, tested them, and moved on. 5 of them east of the Danube, still standing, intact. The chronicles do not record exactly when Béla IV began asking about this. The detail was passed down through Hungarian sources, and may reflect what was remembered and reconstructed rather than a specific documented moment. But what those sources agree on is that at some point during the time in Croatia, Béla IV began asking the same question about each of the castles that had survived. Why that one? What did that one have that the others did not? The Mongols left in the spring of 1242. Ogedei Khan, the ruler of the entire Mongol Empire, had died in December 1241. The princes and generals were required to return east for the succession. The withdrawal had nothing to do with Hungarian resistance. It had nothing to do with anything Béla IV had done. He did not know that yet. Standing on the coast at Trogir, he had no way of knowing why they had left or whether they were coming back. He only knew that they had come once, that Europe had not helped him, that Frederick II had his reasons, and those reasons had cost 1,000,000 lives, that the stone castles had stood when everything else had fallen, and that if he was going to go back, which he was, there was only one question worth asking, not what had failed, what had not. The Mongols left in the spring of 1242. Béla IV was in Croatia, safe. The Pope had offered him asylum. Frederick II controlled the Alpine passes. There were courts in the west that would have received a displaced Hungarian king with sympathy and reasonable comfort. A man in his position had options. What he was returning to had no obvious solution. Half his population was dead or gone. The nobility that remained was divided between those who blamed him for the disaster and those who were simply trying to survive. The Mongols had not conquered Hungary. They had emptied it. There was no occupation to resist, no enemy to negotiate with. There was just absence, silence where a kingdom used to be. And somewhere on the Volga steppe, Batu Khan had established a permanent base, not returning to Mongolia, staying, watching, sending letters to Béla IV demanding submission, waiting for an opportunity to finish what had been started. The Pope offered asylum. The West offered safety. Hungary offered nothing except obligation and the near certainty that the army that had just destroyed everything would eventually come back. What would you have done? Stay in the West, where you were safe, where you could build something manageable, where no one would blame you for choosing survival over an impossible task? Or go back to a country that was half empty, with enemies who had already beaten you once, and no allies willing to help you a second time? Here is what Béla IV did. He went back, and he spent the next 28 years making sure that when the Mongols returned, Hungary would be the last place on earth they wanted to be. The first thing Béla IV did when he returned to Hungary was not rebuild the cities. It was not feed the survivors. It was not negotiate with the nobility who blamed him for the defeat. The first thing he did was visit one of the 5 stone castles that had survived. He walked the walls. He looked at the thickness of the stone. He looked at the position on the hill, the angle of the slope below, the distance between the base and the tree line. He asked the garrison commander what the Mongols had done when they came, how long they had stayed, what they had tried, why they had left. The commander told him the Mongols had arrived with their standard siege equipment, the machines that had broken the walls of Chinese cities and Persian fortresses. They had positioned the equipment at the base of the hill and discovered a problem they had not encountered before. The slope was too steep to move heavy machinery up. The wood they needed to build additional equipment had been cleared from the surrounding area before the siege began. The water supply inside the castle was independent. The garrison could wait indefinitely. The Mongols had stayed 3 days and left. Béla IV stood on the wall and understood something that would define the next 28 years of his reign. He had not discovered a new principle. He had found proof of one that already existed. Stone on high ground, with its own water, with the approach cleared of materials an enemy could use, was something the Mongol system could not process. Not because the Mongols were not intelligent, because their entire method was built around speed and the assumption that every obstacle could be broken or bypassed. A castle that could not be broken and could not be bypassed was outside the parameters of everything Subutai had designed. Béla IV went home and changed the law. Any lord who built a stone castle on his land would receive additional territory from the crown. No questions about purpose or loyalty. No conditions beyond the construction itself. The kingdom needed stone on high ground. He would pay for it with land he did not currently control anyway, because the people who had lived on it were dead. By the end of his reign, Hungary had gone from approximately 10 stone castles to more than 100, 66 of them built entirely to the new standard. Stone walls, elevated positions, independent water supplies, cleared approaches. The second lesson came from a different source. After the Battle of Mohi, one group of fighters had performed differently from everyone else. Not better in the sense of winning, better in the sense of surviving contact with Mongol cavalry without immediately dying. A small number of heavily armored knights, mostly from the Hospitaller and Templar orders, had been able to absorb Mongol arrow fire and remain functional. The arrows hit the armor and stopped. The men inside kept fighting. Béla IV had seen one of them after the battle. The knight's armor had multiple arrows embedded in it at various angles. None had penetrated. The man was exhausted and shaken, but alive. He looked like a wall that had been shot at. That image did not leave Béla IV. In 1247, he negotiated an agreement with the Knights of St. John, land in southeastern Hungary in exchange for military service and assistance in building a new kind of cavalry force. The arrangement was practical on both sides. The knights needed territory. Béla needed men in iron. He then extended the principle downward through the social structure. Any landholder, regardless of birth, who could equip himself as a heavy cavalry soldier and present himself for military service when summoned would be recognized as a noble. The title came with the armor, not the bloodline. Within a generation, Hungary had a substantially different military corps than the one that had been destroyed at the Sajó. In 1259, he sent a request to Venice for 1,000 crossbowmen. The crossbow had shown its value against Mongol cavalry in limited engagements. The weapon had a range and penetration capacity that could reach Mongol riders at distances where the riders themselves could not effectively respond. Deployed from behind stone walls, a crossbowman could engage Mongol cavalry without exposing himself to return fire. The combination of stone walls and crossbows created a defensive system that addressed the specific problem that had destroyed Hungary in 1241. The third piece was the one that required the most patience. The Cuman people had been Hungary's allies before the invasion. They were steppe nomads, skilled cavalry, experienced fighters who understood Mongol tactics from direct contact. They had fled to Hungary seeking protection from the Mongols. During the chaos of 1241, their leader had been killed in a dispute with Hungarian nobles. They had left. They had taken their horses and their knowledge and their fighting capacity with them. Béla IV spent years negotiating their return. He offered them the Great Hungarian Plain, the best agricultural land in the kingdom, the land that had been most completely emptied by the Mongol destruction. He arranged for his son to marry a Cuman princess. He gave them legal autonomy within their settlements. He asked for one thing in return: that they ride for Hungary when Hungary needed riders. The Cumans returned. They settled the plains. They kept their traditions, their weapons, their way of moving on horseback. They also kept their knowledge of how steppe armies operated, how they communicated, what they wore, what weapons they carried, what a Mongol patrol looked like from a distance of 50 yards. In the same years, a Franciscan friar named Giovanni del Carpine had made a journey to the Mongol capital at Karakorum and returned with the first systematic European analysis of Mongol military methods. He was 65 years old when he made the trip. He wrote everything down: how the Mongols organized their units, how they communicated on the battlefield, how they used feigned retreats, how their scouts operated. His most specific recommendation was one that no European army had ever attempted: learn to become invisible inside enemy territory. The Mongols had done it for decades before every major campaign. Europe had no tradition of it. Europe had no method for it. Béla IV read the report. His son, inheriting a kingdom of Cuman riders who knew what Mongol soldiers looked like, would later have the method. By 1270, Béla IV was dying. He had not seen another Mongol army. He had spent 28 years preparing for one. He died without knowing whether any of it would be enough. His son, Laszlo IV, inherited the throne, the castles, the cavalry, the Cumans, and the problem. 15 years later, the Mongols came back. The Mongol army that crossed into Hungary in the winter of 1285 was commanded by a general named Tulabuga. Tulabuga was a grandson of the Golden Horde. He had campaigned across the steppe, through the Caucasus, into the Balkans. He had never lost a major campaign. He came to Hungary with an army estimated between 30,000 and 50,000 soldiers, supported by vassal forces from the Ruthenian princes. He came in winter deliberately, because winter had worked before. Speed across frozen ground, rivers that could be crossed anywhere, an enemy army that needed time to assemble, time the Mongols would not give them. He came with the same plan that had worked in 1241. There was no reason, from where Tulabuga was standing, to use a different plan. The plan had destroyed Hungary 40 years earlier. The plan had destroyed every kingdom that had tried to resist it for 60 years before that. The intelligence reports his scouts had gathered described a country that had been devastated by the previous invasion and was still rebuilding. The plains were underpopulated. The military capacity was unknown, but unlikely to have substantially improved. The plan was sound. His advance forces crossed the Carpathian passes and entered northeastern Hungary. The first village they reached was empty, not abandoned in panic, with food still on tables and animals still in pens. Deliberately emptied. Every person, every animal, every stored grain had been removed before the Mongols arrived. The village itself was intact. There was simply nothing in it. The second village was the same. The third. Tulabuga's army moved south toward Pest, the largest city on the Hungarian plains. In 1241, Pest had been a populated city, full of people who had not moved fast enough to escape. The Mongols had burned it. Tulabuga reached Pest in the winter of 1285 and found a city that had been emptied with the same systematic thoroughness as the villages. Every person inside the walls had been moved before the Mongols came. The buildings were standing. The streets were empty. He looked up. On the hills above Pest and on every defensible elevation within sight were stone castles, not the wooden and earthen fortifications his predecessors had burned in 1241. Stone walls on steep slopes at heights that made approach difficult and siege equipment impossible to position effectively. The people of Hungary were inside those walls, with their food, with their animals, with everything that an invading army needed to sustain itself in hostile territory. Tulabuga had brought an army into a country that had removed everything his army needed to survive. He assessed his options. His siege equipment was designed for the kind of fortifications the Mongols had encountered everywhere else. Hard-packed earth, brick, the materials that made up city walls across Asia and the Middle East. It was not designed for 2-meter stone walls on 40-degree slopes. He did not have the Chinese engineers who had solved similar problems for earlier Mongol campaigns. Those men were gone, dead, or deployed elsewhere over the decades since 1241. He ordered an assault on the nearest castle. The assault failed. He ordered another. It failed. His army was sleeping in the open. The temperature in the Carpathian foothills in winter dropped below what the steppe horses were bred for. These were animals that had evolved for flat, dry cold. The wet cold of Central European winter, combined with snow that reached the animals' bellies in the deeper drifts, was destroying his cavalry's primary asset. Horses that could not move quickly were not Mongol horses anymore. They were just horses standing in snow. The grass that should have fed them was under 2 feet of snow. The food supplies the army had carried from the steppe were running out. There was nothing to requisition. There was nothing to raid. The country had been emptied before they arrived. Soldiers began eating their horses, then the dogs that had accompanied the column, then things that soldiers in other circumstances would not have eaten. And somewhere in the hills around them, watching every movement, were people who knew exactly where Tulabuga's forces were, how many men were in each unit, which direction they were moving, and when they were weakest. The Hungarian scouts who had been tracking Tulabuga's army since it entered the passes were not dressed as Hungarian soldiers. They were wearing kaftans, long silk or rough cloth garments that fell to the knee, the standard outer layer of a Mongol rider's clothing. They wore curved nomadic shoes and fur-lined hats of the style used across the steppe. They carried composite bows, the same short recurved weapons that Mongol cavalry carried on horseback. At a distance of 50 yards in poor light, they were indistinguishable from the men they were watching. The Cuman riders who formed part of Hungary's military had grown up knowing what a Mongol patrol looked like. They had spent their entire lives on the steppe, wearing the same clothes, riding the same way, using the same weapons. When Béla IV's son needed men who could move inside a Mongol army without being detected, he had them. The scouts moved through Tulabuga's lines, counted his units, identified his supply positions, reported his intended route of withdrawal. When Tulabuga finally ordered the retreat, Hungary knew where he was going before he started moving. The route back to the steppe went through the Carpathian passes. The same passes his army had used coming in, now deeper in snow, with horses that were weakened and soldiers who had been hungry for weeks. The passes were narrow. The slopes above them were covered in forest. The Sekali people lived in those forests. The Sekali were a distinct population in the eastern Carpathian region, who had served as border guards for the Hungarian kingdom for generations. They were light cavalry, fast, experienced in the mountain terrain, using horses bred for the slopes rather than the plains. They were, in the most direct sense, a force designed to fight exactly the kind of retreating steppe cavalry that was now moving through their territory. They came down from the slopes in multiple groups, hitting different sections of the Mongol column simultaneously, cutting off retreat for rear units, isolating groups of soldiers from the main force, using the same principle of encirclement that the Mongols had used against everyone else for 60 years. The Mongol lamellar armor, the iron and leather plates laced with silk cord that was flexible and effective in normal conditions, had been in freezing temperatures for weeks. The leather had stiffened. Some of the lacing had cracked. The armor that was supposed to move with the body was moving against it. The crossbow bolts that came from the elevated positions on the slopes penetrated it. Tulabuga's retreat became a rout. Units that had entered Hungary as a coherent military force were reduced to small groups of men trying to find a way through passes that people who knew every path were actively blocking. The Galician-Volhynian Chronicle, one of the few sources that recorded the campaign in detail, described Tulabuga's return. The language suggested a level of losses that made the campaign not merely a failure, but a catastrophe. The tradition that passed through Hungarian sources put a specific image on the result. Tulabuga returned to the steppe with one wife and one horse. It was almost certainly an exaggeration. Chronicles tend toward the memorable rather than the precise, but the underlying fact was not an exaggeration. The largest Mongol army sent into Europe in 40 years had entered Hungary and been destroyed. Not in a single battle, not by a decisive engagement on open ground, by a system that had been built specifically to destroy it. Nogai Khan, commanding the secondary force that had come through Transylvania, had similar results. He burned some towns. He could not take a single major stone castle. The local Saxon, Vlach, and Sekeli militias eventually drove him back across the border. The second Mongol invasion of Hungary ended without the Mongols taking a single fortified position. 2 years later, in 1287, Tulabuga and Nogai turned north and attacked Poland instead. The Polish fortified cities held. The Mongols pillaged the countryside and withdrew. Hungarian nobles, without being asked, without a treaty obligation, without a formal alliance, crossed the border to help the Polish defenders. Henry II the Pious had waited 1 day at Legnica for reinforcements that were 1 day away. The Hungarian nobles who rode into Poland in 1287 had not been asked. They came because they understood, in a way that had not been understood in 1241, that a Mongol force allowed to operate freely in Poland today would be at Hungary's border tomorrow. Béla IV had spent 28 years building a kingdom that knew how to think about the problem. If you want to understand how that knowledge was built, subscribe. The next video goes deeper into the specific system Béla IV created. Link is in the description. Every civilization the Mongols destroyed had one thing in common. They faced the Mongols once, they lost, and they did not get a second chance to learn from it. The Song dynasty fell and was absorbed. Kievan Rus fell and was absorbed. The Abbasid Caliphate fell and was absorbed. The pattern was consistent across 60 years and dozens of campaigns. You faced the Mongol system, the system won, and whatever knowledge you might have gained from the experience died with the civilization that had generated it. Hungary was the exception. Not because Hungary was stronger, because Hungary lost and survived. Not because of anything Béla IV did in the battle. He lost the battle completely. He lost it so thoroughly that he spent months running from an army that was hunting him personally. He reached the Adriatic coast with the remnants of his court and a kingdom that was half empty behind him. He survived because Ogedei Khan died at the right moment, because the Mongols needed to return east to select a new great Khan, because a political event on the other side of the world interrupted a military campaign that had no other reason to stop. Béla IV had 44 years as a result of that accident. The question is what he did with them. Most rulers who survive a catastrophic defeat spend their energy on recovery. Feed the survivors, rebuild the cities, restore the tax base, return the kingdom to what it had been before. This is rational. This is what the situation demands. This is what every instinct and every obligation of kingship points toward. Béla IV did those things, but he also did something that almost no ruler in his position had done before. He asked what had not failed, not what had gone wrong. Every advisor, every chronicle, every lesson drawn from the disaster explained what had gone wrong. The army had been encircled. The Cumans had left. The other European powers had not come. The Mongol tactics had not been understood. The list of failures was comprehensive and well documented. Béla IV looked past the failures and found 5 stone castles east of the Danube that were still standing. That question, what did not fail and why, is a different kind of thinking than what most people do after a disaster. The natural response to catastrophic failure is to analyze the failure, to find the mistakes, correct them, build systems that prevent the same mistakes from happening again. This produces better versions of what already existed. Béla IV was not trying to build a better version of the army that had lost at the Sajó. He was trying to build something the Mongols had never encountered before. The only raw material he had for that project was the evidence of what the Mongols had already failed to destroy. 5 castles. One type of soldier who had survived contact with Mongol arrows. A group of steppe nomads who understood how Mongol cavalry operated from the inside. He took those 3 things and spent 28 years multiplying them. Every organization that has ever rebuilt after a catastrophic failure has faced the same choice. Analyze what went wrong and fix it, or find what survived and build from there. The first approach produces incremental improvement. The second produces something the original enemy does not recognize and does not know how to fight. Tulabuga came to Hungary in 1285 with a plan designed to defeat the kingdom that had existed in 1241. He found a kingdom that had been built specifically to destroy that plan. He did not understand what he was looking at until it was too late to adapt. He had never faced Béla IV. He had only faced the problem Béla IV had already solved. There is one more thing worth saying about all of this. Béla IV never saw the 1285 invasion. He died in 1270, 15 years before the army he had spent his life preparing for finally arrived. He built a system and trusted it to outlast him. It did. The Mongols taught Béla IV exactly how to destroy them. They just did not know they were doing it.